Hello, YouTube. Thanks for joining us today for our last talk of our Change the Image series, which supports leading female creatives both across photography and filmmaking. Today we're here with Bette Lynch, who will be talking to us about her work across her project with ActionAid, Women by Women, and to give some advice for people who are looking to work in similar fields. Hi, Bette. Thanks for being here.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, so who you are and what exactly you do?
Sure. So my name's Bette Lynch and I'm a photographic strategist. I've had a lengthy career. I spent 20 odd years working across national newspapers as a picture editor, and then the latter part of my more conventional career was spent as director of photography at Getty Images, where I was responsible for news across Europe, Middle East and Africa. I then left 3 years ago, I think, and I formed my own agency, which is called 29, and I'm the founder and photographic strategist. And what that means is I help organizations create photography and tell stories that truly reflect who they are and their business. We look at storytelling, we look at how photography has to be fit for purpose for the years ahead, and I help them engage more fully with photography.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we're going to be talking a little bit today about a project you've done with ActionAid, which people may have heard of, and it's called Women by Women.
Yeah.
So since you sort of mentioned your career path there, perhaps that's a good place to start, is to jump in and explain to us a little bit about what that project entailed and what it involved.
Sure. So I've got some slides, but I'll just give you a brief. So back in, and obviously it's difficult to remember years because we've just lost the last one, but back in winter of 2018, I was approached by ActionAid, which is a brilliant global organization. They work with women and girls, specifically around education, ending violence against women and girls. And they asked me to come in, sit on some meetings, have a look at their photography, where it was then, how they used photography to engage with supporters and the fundraising staff, and really have a look at whether it was fit for purpose. We've got a great team there, but after a few sessions with them, we sort of came to the decision that photography needed to sort of re-engage. They needed to tell better stories, and they won't mind me saying this, but they used quite traditional methods as an NGO to reflect their work, ones that I don't necessarily think a younger generation of supporters could identify with. And also it's amazing to me that as an organisation that worked with women and girls, they worked primarily with male photographers, and male photographers whom they would parachute in from the UK ostensibly. Not all, but a lot, 80% of the time. And this was where it sort of fell down for me. So we put together a project called Women by Women. I was interested in, having listened to the work that ActionAid did, I was interested in showing another view of women from the global south. The idea actually came from saying, for every Michelle Obama or Malala, there are thousands and thousands of women working in their communities throughout the global south who are doing incredible and inspirational work. And we wanted to show these stories. So I researched a lot of them. And then with that, the photographic side went hand in hand, was that if we were going to show these inspiring women, then we must have local women photographers to show their stories, to share their stories. And that was a really big deal. And at first, ActionAid was slightly reticent about it. I agreed to work with them to delivery. So I found the women and then had to research the photographers, which thinking in some countries was easy, in other countries less so. You know, there's a real there's a real problem with photography across the global south with women's participation in it, both from an economical point of view and economics point of view of where they are in society, and also the fact that it's just seen as a male profession. So in the end, it took a little time, but we came up with this wonderful campaign. And let me share some, let's share some things with you now. Hang on one second.
Absolutely. It'd be great to hear more about it. I think it sounds like a project that's really required at the moment and is really helping to push more women across the globe into these areas.
Yeah.
Do that work.
So we started off the campaign with, and this was the main poster for it. We decided to start off with Afghanistan because Afghanistan, even then, was still one of the most difficult places on earth for women. I think it's Afghanistan and Yemen. So we found, but I didn't want to give a representation of Afghanistan and Afghan women that we see as downtrodden and burqa clad, and you know, everything that was used to show the representation of women in Afghanistan. I caveat this by saying it was end of 2018, 2019.
Yeah.
So we found some incredible women in Afghanistan, 6 women who wanted to participate as subjects across a broad range of careers, women who were inspiring, women who were putting their head above the parapet and doing jobs that were traditionally seen as either male, the preserve of men, or were simply not allowed under the previous Taliban regime. And you can obviously see from my face that we're now in a very different situation again in Afghanistan. I found 2 photographers, women photographers who work locally in Kabul, who were willing to take on the commission, and I worked with them closely, and they came up with a quite superb set of pictures. You'll see as I go through the slideshow that I should normally have a photograph of the photographer there. Yeah. And you'll notice I haven't said her name either. There's another photograph there of the other photographer who participated. And here should be where we show the inspirational women and the work that was produced. But sadly, because of events over the last few months, for their safety, I'm unable to do that. You'll see from the words there that there was a fashion designer, kickboxer, street artist, a politician, a yoga instructor, which might not sound a lot, but under the Taliban, yoga was illegal. It was deemed to be a religion and it couldn't be practiced. Yeah. So all women who were incredibly brave. And I will say, even then, in what was at the time a relative amount of freedom for women in Kabul especially, the photographers that participated were constantly harassed in the street by men, having had their cameras around their neck. The women, especially the street artists, were harassed. It wasn't easy. Their freedoms were very, very much curtailed. However, they could exist and they had a life. The fashion designer had her own shop. The politician was one of the first women and the youngest female politician to be in the parliament in Kabul. But sadly, we can't show them anymore.
Yeah.
I know that some of the women have got out to safety. and I don't know the whereabouts of the others. So
just to clarify for those watching, we're not talking, 10 or 15 years ago. We're talking 2 years ago, 3 years ago.
Yes, the Afghan part of this was put together, as I say, by the two photographers in 2019, and it would have been the first, probably took about 3 months for us to research the women, get in touch with them, ask for their participation. ActionAid had an office in Kabul that were willing to help me and liaise, and then work with both photographers to see, how we wanted and how they wanted to approach the commission. It's been a tremendously worrying time, having built up a very good relationship with both the subjects and the photographer.
Yeah. To
find themselves in the situation that they found themselves in over the last few months. And sadly, I only see things going backwards. And if you think about it, if we'd have been doing this talk 3 months ago, I'd have happily shown you their work and their faces and the faces of the photographers. So it says something when I can't do that for their safety. So, but from Afghanistan, we did move on, and I can at least show you some pictures. So we moved on to Esther Mbazi in Uganda. Esther's a brilliant photographer, and we worked together to show stories of women who live in Kampala.
Sorry to interrupt you, Bette.
That's
your
all right.
Screen appears to have crashed. The joys of being live.
Oh, really?
Would you mind just unsharing and sharing again for us?
No, of course. Hang on.
Apologies for those watching.
Apologies. Let's stop the share.
Always happens when you're live. It's one of those things, I think.
Yeah. Let's have a look here.
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect.
If I do it as a slideshow.
Excellent.
Are we seeing that now?
Let's have a wait. No, so if you...
Okay, well, what I'll do is I will do it so you can see my workings out in the corner.
Perfect.
Can you see that?
Yes, there we are.
Okay, we'll do it this way. So, Women by Women in Uganda, and there is Esther Mbazi, who's a brilliant Ugandan photographer who I'd heard about and I'd wanted to work with for a while. And we wanted to look at women in Kampala, who lots of people refer to the Kampalan area where they live as the slum.
Yeah.
It's their home. And the women that we used here were women that had built their own businesses, which created economic, obviously, stability for them, not just them, but their families, their friends who went to work with them, and had done that from a sort of small grant scheme and really had become leaders in their community. And Esther did a quite brilliant job in bringing them to life. And I think this photograph, there's a few within all the other sets as well, but the connection that you get from a woman being photographed by another woman who is maybe known to them or lives locally. So actually nothing is really out of the ordinary. This is their home. And I think from it, what I learned, and actually it was a big learning curve for me, is that you just get a depth of empathy and understanding that you don't get when you're sending somebody else into the country. And these women, this lady here is a nurse, and again, she has a small clinic in the sort of township in Kampala where she lives, which has been there for 20 odd years. She's a grandmother of many, many grandchildren. She fosters and adopts children, but she runs a sexual health clinic.
Yeah.
Okay, she wants a sexual health clinic, but it's deeply religious, the society in which she lives, and it's incredibly difficult for her to go about her work. But through perseverance and bringing understanding to the community, she's managed to do it. So we moved on then to South Africa, where we wanted to show the next stage and level of youth activism in South Africa in a kind of post-Mandela world. And these were shot by Mura Rajanori, again, a brilliant photographer, and a very nice quote. I always think that's a great quote from Mura. And she's right. There are a lot of female African photographers, and they are incredibly badass, and they're just brilliant. And this, in a kind of commissioning way, you know, traditionally, and in my career when I've worked in a news environment, it's very much, you know, this is happening, go here. Yeah. And there's a direction to a photographer. This was very much in collaboration. So Mura and I gathered together, again with the help of the office in Johannesburg, gathered together a diverse range of activists. And Mura and I talked about how we wanted it to be fun.
Yeah.
We didn't want it to be a portrait session. Mura was like, oh my God, you know, when you commissioned me, I thought it was going to be one of those dreadful kind of, sorry to anybody watching, but, you know, slightly dull, traditional NGO portrait sessions.
Headshot.
And she said, where are we going to do it? And I said, well, you live there. Where do you think? So this was all done in her back garden against a pink backdrop that she bought. And they range, you know, this is beautiful. This woman is a lady called Millicent, who is an activist for women's land rights. This lady, Caddy, is HIV and campaigns for that. And I mean, there's many more to each set, obviously. Yeah. So I just pulled out some highlights because I love them. And this set in particular, I think, brings to bear what we wanted from Women by Women, which was the joy of other women, the fact that they are inspirational, that they're doing great work, that they have sometimes difficult lives, let's be honest, but the work is being done and they're working with their community in a kind of next generation. And for me, that was just brilliant. We switched over then to Guatemala. Guatemala has a terrible problem with domestic violence rates.
Yeah.
This is a hip hop artist called Rebecca Lane.
That's a beautiful photograph. Absolutely. Yeah.
And she uses her voice, her music, to campaign against domestic violence in Guatemala. She draws a lot of attention to herself. It's not always pleasant. The photographer Morena, who did a brilliant job photographing Rebecca, and we went to one of her concerts. And again, we wanted to show a kind of different side of inspirational people, women using music to inspire other young women and men. I mean, you'll see at concerts, there is, it's a very mixed crowd who go to see her, and she has a massive following. And I just love her. And I love this set of pictures. And I've just seen on Instagram that she's just had a baby 2 days ago, Rebecca. So that's lovely. This is possibly my favorite story. This was in the DRC. A woman called Marceline Butzer, who's obviously from the DRC. She wanted to bring coffee production back to the islanders, Idiji Island, which is on this huge lake that separates the DRC from Rwanda, I think. Yeah. And on it live 1,800 ostensibly war widows. Average age kind of 48. They have a lot of children. Some women have between 10 and 14 children. no men because they were all lost in the war. And so Marceline taught them, brought coffee back onto the island, planted it, taught them with the help of others how to grow it, how to harvest it, and how to make coffee production, which had always been pre-war, sort of viable thing, bringing economic stability to the 1,800 women that live in that community. It is a fantastic story.
Yeah.
And in fact, there is Marceline in the centre. She goes over to the island every so often, and she is showing some of the women, some of the farmers. She's showing them on her iPhone some of the publicity that they got from various coffee magazines, actually, which is what that was. There was a little bit of portraiture. There's a whole set of these. The organisation is called Rebuild Women's Hope. You can, where I live, strangely, you can go into our local deli and buy coffee beans that are from Rebuild Women's Hope, which I love.
That's so good.
And the difficulty, you know, in finding, logistically, in finding Pamela, who lived in Goma, in the DRC capital, to be able to get her to a spot where a guy with a boat would pick her up and take her to the island. It wasn't without its difficulty, because you know what, you're asking a photographer, a woman photographer. You have to have the conversations about traveling alone.
Yeah.
How is she going to get there? If I've commissioned somebody, I am responsible for them.
Of course.
And where you kind of think as an accepted norm, you know, the train is, or it wasn't a train, sorry, the bus is only a few dollars, then we need this, then she's going to be away for 3 days. Normally, of course, expenses would be added on at the end. But when you're talking to somebody who perhaps doesn't have that available fund, how's she going to get there? Obviously, you can wire money, but if you've ever tried to wire money from the UK to the DRC, and we're talking like $300. Nobody's doing millions.
Yeah.
It is a logistical nightmare because people automatically think you're gun runners. So due to the extreme patience of Pamela and some help, we did get her there, and she produced a beautiful set of pictures. But yes, the challenges were not just in researching the women, finding the stories, but really in facilitating for some of the photographers how they would be able to go about their work and ensuring their safety. That's Marceline. And then finally, I guess, this is from the second phase. The most encouraging thing for me was that when my relationship with ActionAid ended, when that first phase of the project was finished, which was at the beginning of March 2020, it wasn't done and dusted. And I was delighted to hear that it had changed their policy. ActionAid will now, where possible, only commission local women photographers and videographers. And in fact, they've just done a whole fundraising shoot out in Nigeria where the entire crew were women, videographers, editors, photographers, everybody. And they had very happily said it, that change had come through this first phase. This is a quote from the exhibition that took place a couple of weeks ago, that were more stories in a sort of phase 2 of Women by Women. And I pulled this quote out because you and I, Tiffany, were talking earlier about small things, very small steps. But when those small steps are taken, small steps snowball and snowball, and the effect shouldn't be underestimated. And this for me was extraordinary. I've never had my photograph taken by a woman before, and that in itself is a big occasion. And that this is kind of the woman from that quote, and a photograph by Ina. And I thought, what a brilliant message is that another woman hadn't had her photograph taken ever by a woman. And so the meeting of those two women was worth its weight in gold to me. So anyway, there you are. That's my, they're my slides.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that's really interesting is that we're not sort of saying that, you know, if you're taking a picture of a fish, then always send a woman. But I think with topics like this, what's really engaging and interesting is that women do feel safer with other women, and especially in countries where the issues that they're facing are coming from a lot of male governments or male-led movements. And so I think the work that you've done here is incredible, to give women a voice when they're maybe not sure about speaking, and to give them an opportunity to speak to somebody they trust and that understands where they're coming from.
Yeah, and to some degree, both for the subject and the photographer. And that was always at the very, you know, the concept idea of Women by Women, that it was a voice and a platform, not only for the subject, but for the photographer. And when I've spoken before on Women by Women, and people say, well, how difficult was it to find the photographers? And, you know, having spent 30 years working in a fairly male-dominated kind of news photography, so how difficult was it to find them? And I always have to say, do you know what, it was surprisingly easy.
Yeah,
they are there all over the world, not just African photographers, but Latino photographers, they're all Asian photographers, they're all there. If you've a mind to, you will find them. You just have to have that mindset of instead of going, oh, well, for the sake of ease, we'll just send him again. And I think you make a very valid point. It's not to the exclusion of men at all. And if I were doing another job, if I was doing a job that was more news related, perhaps, you have to find somebody who has the relevant experience and can be safe and secure and pull that job off. And it might not be appropriate to send a woman photographer into that scenario. It might, but somebody asked me about the Afghan photographers in particular, and did I fear for their safety? And did I think that I was fair? That was fair, putting them perhaps in harm's way, having to photograph women on the street. And I said, well, that's not my decision. You have to talk to the photographer.
Yeah.
We have to weigh everything up. And if I'm comfortable and they're comfortable, and then you have to go with that. It's not for me to dictate what is or isn't. I would put the same security checklist in for a man as I would for a woman. And it does come down sometimes to experience of the job. But most women I've ever spoken to, you know, if you have an honest conversation about it, some people go, look, I'm fine. And others might go, I'm not ready yet.
Yeah.
But you have to have the conversation with them.
And it can be quite, as you said, it's very situational, because I imagine the stuff that you were doing 2 years ago in Afghanistan, you know, as we mentioned at the start of this talk, we might not be doing now. And I think that's really important, that when you're choosing photographers, whether for projects like this, where there is a huge pressure to get the narrative correct and to tell people's stories, or whether you're choosing somebody to take an advert for John Lewis, it's about selecting somebody that can get the best from your subjects and tell the story correctly. And in this situation,
I will also say that there's an awful lot of trust, and Pamela in particular, you know, some of the women haven't got all of the kit that that a Getty photographer would have, where they travel with belly cases full of kit. So sometimes they're limited. And also, if there's anybody out there who is in the role where you commission photographers, Pamela's a very good example, because she hasn't really got, or she didn't, at the time, she didn't really have a website. Yeah. I couldn't view masses of her work. And it's easy to dismiss. It's easy to go, well, I can't see much. There's a couple of friends that are quite nice, but I can't see this breadth of work that you've done. And you have to say, why is that? Well, because you don't get the commissions. So therefore, you haven't got that breadth of work that other photographers might have. And so a lot of it I do in particular, I called Pamela, and you know what, after a few conversations, and we talked about photography and who she likes and how she likes to work, you can get a feel very quickly for whether somebody is going to be able to do the job to the level that you'd want. So, you mustn't be put off, especially with photographers who haven't had a voice or a platform, to talk to them, get a feel for them, because you might not be able to see all their work.
Yeah. So one thing I would like to talk to you about is, obviously the topics we're discussing, they're large stories of women who are really pushing forward their communities and are striving to make change. And I wondered, something we spoke about in our own time was about whether the plethora of emotions that come out in those scenarios, how the photographers deal with that, how you sort of prepare yourself from a mental health perspective, and how you recover once you've been to those places and seen the situations unfold.
Okay. On bigger kind of more news stories, are we talking about, of where there may be some form of natural disaster or trauma? I think it's, years ago, well, it was never talked about. I don't think it is sufficiently anymore. Still, it's not talked about sufficiently. I've sent photographers all over the world covering some pretty grim stories. And especially at Getty, as a DOP, part of my role is gatekeeper to what the photographer is sending in to versus what we deem to be dignified enough to be able to send out on the wire, because you have to always keep that in mind, the dignity of the person involved in the picture. And I think it's twofold. I think for photographers, and obviously I've never been a photographer, but I think there has to be within the industry a really important question about having some form of counselling to offload almost what they've seen, what they've witnessed, who they've worked with, because I struggle to see how it wouldn't affect them.
Yeah.
Because on the flip side of that, what I'm seeing has affected me, and I'm not on the ground. If I'm honest, I only realise it's affected me since I've been out of it. When you're in it, you look at pictures that in hindsight are truly horrific.
Yeah.
But I, for years, was detached for it. Not completely detached, because I think once you lose all humanity, then you're in the wrong job. But I mean, in terms of viewing the picture, there has to be a distance, because otherwise, when you're struggling, when you're looking at some difficult stories, there has to be a certain detachment. Otherwise, you'd be in tears of it. You never get home. Yeah. But that does build up, and it does accumulate. And certainly in the last couple of years, since I've been away from that type of story, I have realized that not all, but there are a couple of big stories that deeply affected me. And if they deeply affected me, they must have been even worse for the photographer.
Yeah, absolutely. We've actually had a really beautiful question come in from AO. So hello AO, who's asked what photography means to you in the position that you're in and in the jobs that you've done, and I guess in a passion way.
It's sort of, thank you for the question. It's a sort of twofold thing, really. Bringing stories, bringing women to the forefront, to a wider audience through photography, like Women by Women, means everything to me. Photography has always been an opportunity to share stories and to show the world, to share knowledge. And there's no better medium in doing that than photography. That sometimes can be beautiful, and you have a connection, as you have with Caddy there, seen on the screen, and you think, wow, you know, her face, and it draws you in, brilliant. The flip side of that is also, you know, it can be quite ugly, and having to show people situations where it is the darker side of humanity.
Yeah.
But I've always had a belief that you have to show both. You have to show all of it. And it's really, really important to me that, and we'll take, for example, the refugee crisis in 2015, when we had a situation that people from all over the world, a lot of Syrians, were coming into Europe by any means possible. And I hope you all remember that. It went on throughout the summer. And people were landing on beaches in Greece and ostensibly trying to walk through Europe to Germany. You could take a big picture, thousands of people coming. But it's never what interests me. What interests me is who they are. I mean, who the hell gets up in the middle of the night with a carrier bag and has to leave their home and walk to Germany?
Yeah.
And I'm never interested in that big, let's say, front page picture, although, you know, if you did the job I did, you had to be interested to some degree because we're supplying. But I always wanted to know their names. I wanted to know who they were. I was always interested in the humanity of it, as were my team of photographers at the time. And we had 10 photographers in different countries. And the greatest compliment, I think, in all of our coverage, trying to unearth, which is a big thing for me, unearthing stories, trying to unearth what was the story behind these headlines, and who were the people and why had they left? And all of the photographers tried to get behind that. I'm immensely proud of that piece of work, of that summer of work. And in fact, one of the picture editors on a big national newspaper said to me, when we were looking through the thousands of images every day to, you know, what are we going to use and what are we going to do? She said, I could always tell if it was one of your guys, because you covered the story with immense humanity in a way that perhaps others just covered the story, which there's nothing the matter with that. But so for me, photography is a passion, but it's sharing knowledge to try and get to a better understanding of each other.
Do you think the visualization helps the general public emotively connect to crises across the globe?
Yes.
In a way that maybe words just couldn't quite.
Oh, you totally. I mean, I'm so old, I remember the days when photography was finished. There's no place for photography. There's no place for photography in newspapers. Online hadn't emerged yet. There's the death of it. And in fact, that's when one could argue, you know, newspapers were starting to make their photographers redundant. I mean, at one point, there's a very famous photograph of the Express back when it was a fairly decent newspaper in its broadsheet days. There's a famous photograph of the Express lining up all of their photographers, all male, by the way, but all suited and booted. And I think they had about 69 of them.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think what we saw, which nobody expected, was with online, with social media, in a very short space of time, it's gone from photography being down there somewhere, especially in publications of, here's the words, oh, give us a quick picture of that, will you?
Yeah.
To this resurgence where really photography is key. And photography is key for every organization. It's not just about news and media. How you reflect your work through photography. What is the message you want to give? Who do you hire? How do you hire them? What rates do you pay? I will say, which is really important to me, that every single female photographer that was commissioned was paid exactly the same rate, day rate and expenses that a UK photographer would have been paid. And that was really important. So it's not like, oh, his day rate's $500. Well, she's from the DRC, so what, $50? No, everybody got the same.
Yeah, I think that's hugely important and underrated. We do that here at WAX during these weeks. We do it throughout the year. And I do think it's one of those things that you have to be thoughtful about that. You know, maybe money is worth more in Western culture, but, you know, they're doing the same job. It's the same responsibility.
It's not for me to decide kind of macroeconomics of who's worth more or what. If somebody's spent their time and shared their knowledge and experience with me, then they have to be paid the same amount. Yeah,
absolutely. Could I ask, so obviously this campaign is hugely important, not just to yourself, but to the globe, in my opinion. And I wonder if you have any advice for people on how they can get involved in projects like this, for people who are really looking to make a difference themselves.
Sure. Do you know what? As I was saying a few minutes ago, you know, people said photography is over and this and that. And it's very difficult. I think the key thing that's emerged, possibly in the last couple of years, since conversations have started to change around who is and isn't allowed to participate in photography. So, as I've said, I'm not a photographer. But I've been around the block in photography for a long time. And what I've seen is the emergence of groups and collectives that are all trying to shine a light on different types of photographers who are doing brilliant work, either at a community level or on a broader level. Carolyn Mendelsohn, who's a brilliant photographer who lives up in North. Small thing, well, it's not a small thing, it's a gigantic thing. You know, during lockdown, she has teenage children, and she thought, Jesus, how are we going to do this? In the end, I'll cut the long story short, but she developed this thing through our Lens COVID-19 project, which some of you may be familiar with, where she said to lots of teenagers in and around where she lives, online like this, you've all got a phone. Let me teach you how to use it properly, the settings, all that kind of thing. And then I'm going to work with you to document what lockdown is like for a teenager.
Yeah.
She gave them themes throughout the week and all this, and it's grown and it's brilliant. I hope that model gets rolled out around schools, because one of my big things is how we're starting to break down some of the barriers. There's a lot of work to be done. My big thing is trying to engage with working class children of all bases, but working class children and how you can get them involved in creative industries. Photography is expensive, as a lot of you will know out there, to get started. So I would say hunt around, have a look for the collective or the group, the UK Black Women's Photographers Group. You know, everybody is out there making some noise, which I love, using their voices, questioning how things have been done. And through the through the relationship building and the network building that you have of getting to know other photographers, of getting to know editors like myself, then I think you have a support network, you find out about jobs, because even just 3 or 4 years ago, people were saying, well, I'm never going to get a job on a newspaper or an agency because, you know, I haven't got the experience. But it's not all about that anymore.
Yeah.
It's about finding those groups who are going to support you, who are going to guide you through the process, who are going to critique your work with you, who are going to introduce you to people, who are going to get commissions and interest from other people and grow with that group. And I think that's a really important thing, because a lot of photographers get disheartened by saying, oh, you know, I sent a pitch to Fiona Shields at The Guardian, who I love. She's a very great friend of mine, but I know how many pitches she gets and how busy she is. There is no greater opportunity at the moment to find an avenue for people to see your work and to try and get commissions through groups, through collectives, from being active and vocal in whatever area you want to be active and vocal in.
Yeah.
Mainly though, just keep taking pictures, honing your craft, take pictures every day. It doesn't matter what it is, doesn't matter how you see it, doesn't matter what it's on. Tom Stoddard gave a podcast the other week where he just uses one camera now.
Yeah.
You know, he just uses one camera, but he knows how to use it inside and out. It's not about, especially with kind of working class, or with anybody really, it's not about buying stuff with swags and tails. Hone your craft and find your gang and grow within that.
Yeah, I think it's a piece of advice we get a lot on our channels, and I think it is the most honest and most real, is take more pictures.
Yeah,
take pictures of everything and everyone and all of the time.
Find an angle. I love that. You know, Olivia Harris last year, nobody was working last year, but Olivia walked around the streets of London to find out, you know, in a really urban setting where not everybody has the luxury of a garden, find out where people were putting their faces to sunlight. Yeah. You know, out of a top floor window, somebody put a little towel on a windowsill and was sitting, balancing precariously, reading their book. And to have that kind of, I'm just going to wander around and see and I'm going to make something out of nothing, is great. It's a real skill for a photographer to have.
Thank you so much, Bet. I'm aware of the time, but this has been so incredibly interesting, and
thank you.
It's amazing to see that people are really pushing now for women and for fantastic female photographers, and even just local photographers, to photograph their local home territory. So yeah, thank you so much for being there with us today and for talking with us. For everyone who's watching, this was our final talk for this year's Women in the Industry series. You can catch up on YouTube at any time. All of our talks are listed on there. And thank you so much if you joined us this week. I hope you all have a really great afternoon, and thanks again, Beth.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.